We want to thank everybody for joining us today in what is going to be our final session for the virtual crop talk series. So I want to thank everybody for joining us pretty much the entire month of February and on into March here, and appreciate you taking part in all of our sessions. So of course, we could not do this without all of our agents that are on the team. And we'll run through those just because without this team, these sessions would not be possible. So Emily Benningsdorf up in Thomas County, Aaron Highland in Rawlins, Keith Van Skyke in the Quinn Creeks District, Cody Miller in the Phillips Rooks District. You also have Sandra Wick up in the Post Rock District, Craig Dinkle in Midway District, Stacy Campbell in the Cottonwood District, myself, Chris Long, here in the Walnut Creek District, Clint Bain in the Golden Prairie District, and then, of course, Jeannie Falk-Jones. Jeannie's not going to be with us today, but she was a very integral part in all of these sessions. So Jeannie being up she's multi-county agronomist up in the Sunflower District. So again, want to thank all of these agents. At any time, if you have questions or anything to follow up with, at the end of our session, feel free to contact any of them and they'll be sure to help you out. As we're going through the session today, if you do have questions, you can go ahead. If you're on Zoom, you can go ahead and plug those into the Q&A box down at the bottom of your screen and type them in there, and our presenter or one of the agents will bring that up at the end of the session. If you're on YouTube, you can also type your question into the comment box. And to do that, you will also need an account. So make sure you've done that as well. But you can type that into the chat box and you'll be good to go there. You can also email your questions. If you don't have those two options, you can email your questions. I know here on the screen it does say Jeannie's email, but with her not being on today, you can email those to Sandra Wick at swick@ksu.edu. We'll probably throw that into the chat box here in just a minute as well. Oh, Craig has already done that, swick@ksu.edu. Thank you, Craig. All right, we do utilize, and I know Lucas is going to be using this later on in his presentation, we do have the poll everywhere. That this is going to be interactive. There are going to be questions asked and you can plug your responses in. If you've been following us the entire series, you've done this before. If you have not, the instructions are here. Open your web browser and go to pollev.com/KSU, or you can simply text KSU to the number 22333. So those are your instructions there. I'll give you just a second to get that brought up before we go into our first question. All right. We're going to go ahead and jump to that. Next, so our test question. Yesterday, everybody had plenty of wind. So what was your wind speed yesterday? Already we're getting some high numbers there, 11 to 25 miles an hour. I would say we were pushing for a little over 25 down here. So it looks like the majority so far is at 11 to 25 miles an hour at 80%. It was moving yesterday. Hopefully didn't have too much soil moving around. Jumping up to 83%. So we had a windy one. I think today is supposed to be a little bit better and even have a little bit of moisture, hopefully by the end of the week. So with that, my PowerPoint was acting up a little bit there. So I'm going to go ahead and reshare my screen. Sorry for the technical difficulties. All right. Let me close out of the poll everywhere. Maybe that will go away. Again, I apologize. There we go. That's what I was looking for. Those of you that are needing CCA credits, you have two ways of doing that. If you've been on here before or throughout the series, you can email Jeannie at jfalkjones@ksu.edu. And at the beginning, you'll want to email at the beginning and at the end of the webinar. You'll need your name and your CCA number to do that. Or you can scan the QR code that will be posted on the session here or at the end of the session with your Certified Crop Advisor app at the end here. So we'll be able to, with the app, we'll get your CCA credits. Either one of those two routes will work. All right, we're going to get ready to hand it over to Lucas. Today, we do have Dr. Lucas Haag, and he is going to discuss corn dynamics. Lucas is the Northwest Region Agronomist with K-State. Lucas serves 29 counties in the Northwest and North Central part of the state with applied research and extension in crops, range, and soils to improve the productivity and profitability of the ag industry. So with that, I'm going to stop mine and turn it over to Lucas.
All right, thanks, Chris. Can you hear me and you can see the slides?
Yep, sounds good.
All right, so appreciate that and appreciate those of you who took time to join us today. I know it's a really nice day today and things to be doing out in the field. So we're a small group today, but we'll try and hopefully share a few things that you might find worth your time. So just want to give an update, and some of this we would have discussed at the Cover Your Acres conference here a few years back, and some of the management work we were doing focused on dryland corn, but wanted to provide more of an update and some of the new things that we're working on and some of the data from this past year. So I don't need to show this. Chris already got everyone up and rolling with the polling. We'll use that a few times here. Actually, we're going to start here. And so this is, you can just text your answer. But the question is, how many years have you been planting dryland corn? And so you can just text that number to that 22333. So yeah, so kind of interesting, the numbers that are coming in. We really kind of have this, and this is, I think, fairly typical. We've got some areas in the territory I cover where dryland corn's been a fairly, has been around for 20 years or so now, and we've got still see quite a few new growers coming into corn, and so it's always interesting to how that we get some different perspectives. So I would ask, especially for those of you that have been growing dryland corn for an extended period of time, in general, if you think about the hybrids you're using today in terms of maturity, today, are you planting hybrids that are longer in maturity, about the same, or shorter than what you would have been planting, say, 5, 10, 15 years ago whenever you started growing dryland corn? All right, give just a minute in case there's any more to come in. Okay, so most of you are saying you're planting something longer. Several of you saying the same, and I'll be honest, this surprises me a little bit. We'll come back to this a little later in the presentation, but there's really been, at least what I can detect, a little bit of a push. In the industry, there's been a lot more moving people towards shorter season varieties, or at least that's what I sense, maybe more so here in the immediate in Colby area, and we'll show some data later on that I think is worth thinking about in terms of maturity and hybrid selection. Okay, so if we think about what's changed over time, especially those of you who've been planting dryland corn for 20 years or so, we've really seen this decline in what's called ASI, or anthesis silking interval. And if you think about today, we've got a lot less in the way of pollination issues. There's much more reliable, even in the face of heat and drought stress. We don't see near the issues with pollination that we did 15, 20, 25 years ago. And that's really been an effort in the industry to shorten up this anthesis silking interval. So basically, we're talking about how many days delay is there from when the corn tassels to when the silks actually appear. And so by shortening up that lag, we're making sure that pollination process is more in sync and we're less susceptible to heat and drought. The other thing here, increased resistance to barrenness, and this goes into our thought process about seeding rate. It used to be if we planted corn too thick for the environment, we would typically see barren plants as a result. And what we see in the hybrids today, and what's really been interesting, especially some of our dryland trials here in Northwest Kansas, we're running some rates on up as high as 27,000. Very seldom do we actually see a barren plant. It might not be a great ear, but we generally see every plant at least setting an ear, much different than 15, 20 years ago when we would have had a much higher incidence of barrenness. Now, barrenness can still happen, obviously. If we have enough stress, we can certainly see that response. We have seen improved yield potential of short and mid-season hybrids, and a lot of that is as the industry is focused on expanding corn acres into the northern plains. There's been a lot of development work that's gone into that 90 to 100, 105 day class, and our mid-season hybrids, that 106 to 110 day range, has really seen a lot of advancements in terms of their yield potential. So I want to spend just a little bit starting off talking about seeding rate and some of the works we've been doing there. And this really goes into the bigger picture of how do we implement variable rate seeding from a precision ag standpoint. And, one of the things I think we sometimes forget is that, these hybrids that are on the market can have vastly different response curves to seeding rate. And so, understanding that is important if we're actually going to be effective at writing a variable rate seeding prescription. This is complicated by the fact that we've got fairly rapid turnover of hybrids. And so by the time we tend to get comfortable with a product, familiar with how a product responds in our environment, it's likely gone and been replaced by something else. And so that makes it that much more difficult to have some comfort with the products that we're using. We know that yield components flex differently and at different rates for different hybrids. There's fewer companies publicizing any type of ear flex scoring of their products. And this has always been kind of a fuzzy term. There's no strong definition in terms of what is ear flex, how do you quantify it, and how do you score it. It's always kind of been each company's had their own way to characterize that, which has made comparing products across companies somewhat difficult. So just some of the on-farm work we've done. We've had multiple years of trials. This is dryland up in Decatur County. We're typically running around 38 hybrids, and we would plant as low as 8,100 and as high as 27,000. And so you might say, well, why that wide of a range? We know 8,100 is too low, and we know 27,000 is too high, and that's certainly correct. But what we really want to tease out is out of these wide set of hybrids, how do they respond differently to their environmental conditions? If we've got a good year with a good amount of resources available, what's the ability of that hybrid to flex to meet that environment and take that good situation and turn it into yield? So we're measuring yield, kernel rows, kernels per row, kernel weight. These studies typically are in the neighborhood of 800 to 1,100 plots, individual plots in size. We'll go through in each of those plots, pull out 5 ears that we count kernel rows, kernels per ear row, and then we measure kernel weight on, and then we machine harvest the plot to get yield. Here's just an example of some of the wide ranges of responses we see in the field. So each of these photos is off of 5 plants. And so, here on the left-hand side, we've got these 5 really nice size ears. Obviously a non-prolific hybrid, because we've completely filled these ears, but we've still only got 5 ears, so 1 ear per plant, so non-prolific. As opposed to the image up here in the upper right, a more prolific type hybrid, where basically we're setting, you can see 1 primary and 1 secondary ear per plant, but still filled pretty nicely. And then, of course, the image in the lower right, which we'd rather not have, where we've really got this hodgepodge of primary ears and then these secondary ears that really didn't amount to anything. So a wide range of responses that we've seen in these studies. Here's just an example of a couple. Here's four hybrids that I picked out for an example here. So here is grain yield on the y-axis versus seeding rate. So as we go from 8,100 on up to 27,000, we can see these dashed lines represent the different the response curves for these 4 different hybrids, and a couple of them overlap pretty tightly, so you really can't see it. But if we look here, this difference between hybrid 30 here in the red and hybrid 6 and hybrid 11 over here in the blue, what I want to point out here is, okay, at this 150 bushel yield level, there was basically a 5,000 seed per acre difference in terms of what was required to hit that 150 bushel yield level. And at, between $2 and $3 a thousand for seed, the seed cost of this is not insignificant. We're talking, $2 a thousand, we're talking $10 an acre, on up to maybe $15 an acre spread here for the same yield goal. So what can we learn about these hybrids in terms of how they respond, and can we pick that apart? So here's just an example, just looking at a histogram of the hybrids, the nearly 40 hybrids we had in 2018, the range of optimal seeding rates. Now, I'll couch this, my caveat here is 2018 was a spectacular year in terms of dryland yields in Decatur County. And so we've got really high optimal seeding rates in this single site year, saying, hey, we probably should have been planting a lot of this at 24,000. But just looking at the range, we've got everything from 20,000 to 34,000. And even in our drier years, we see that where we've got some stuff where the optimum might have been 12,000, but there's also some stuff where the optimum was 24. That's a huge range to try and cover. So we've talked about prolificity. We know that we can get flex from kernel rows, kernels per row, kernel weight, and then we'll revisit the whole issue of tillers. So here's kind of comparing, or this is looking at a single hybrid. And so the blue diamonds represent yield per plant, okay? And that's on the left-hand axis here. That's pounds of grain per plant. And in the red blocks here represent the overall grain yield, and that's on the right-hand axis. So keep in mind, as seeding rate goes up, yield per plant actually goes down, okay? But how do we get to yield? Well, we've got yield per plant times the number of plants gets us to yield. And so it's really about understanding these relationships of, as we increase seeding rate, how fast am I giving up yield per plant? And the rate at which I give up yield per plant as seeding rate goes up is what really drives these different seeding rate response curves that we see in the field. Now, I'll say, I think of all those treatments we've put out, the one that I feel like we're learning the most from is when we go out and plant this corn at 8,100 plants per acre, because you really get a feel for what's the capability of that plant to set productive tillers. What's the capability of that plant to set multiple ears per main plant? What's its ability, if we're 8,100 in most years, it should not be resource limited. We should max out kernel rows, kernels per ear row. And so you really get to see what are the capabilities of that particular hybrid when it's not resource limited. And so here's just one particular year of the study. Each diamond represents a hybrid. These are all planted at 8,100. And so we see a range in yields from 85 bushel an acre to 121 bushel an acre, all off of 8,100 seed drop. And so that really tells you there's a wide range out there in terms of a plant's ability of an individual plant to make use of its resources. And so what I can tell you is down here at this 85 bushel mark, these are generally hybrids that are non-prolific. They're going to set 1 year per plant period, regardless how much resources it has available to it. And so obviously that really caps your yield potential, as opposed to at these higher yield levels when we're raising 120 bushel corn off 8,100 plants. Those are plants that are prolific. They set multiple ears per main stock, and they tend to do a good job of filling those ears. So as we also look at that, so this is another way of looking at, okay, what's driving this yield per plant? So here's ears per plant looking versus yield per plant. So not surprisingly, as yield per plant goes up, part of that's being driven by ears per plant. So in other words, the ability of these hybrids to set multiple ears. Kernel rows actually fairly flat. And again, go back to think from a growth and development standpoint, when are we setting kernel rows? Well, that's at the V5 stage. And so really, should not be resource limited at that stage. And kernel rows is largely genetically driven. And so we see that differ amongst hybrids, but really not a real strong relationship from kernel rows to yield per plant. Now we do see a bit of a relationship, not surprisingly, as yield per plant goes up. I'm sorry, I got the wrong slide here. This is total kernels per plant. Kernel rows slightly increasing, positive trend. And then finally looking at kernels per ear row, as yield per plant goes up, kernels per ear row actually comes down. Now that seems very counterintuitive at first, but if you think about what's happening here, as yield per plant goes up, part of that's being driven by ears per plant. So we have more ears out there, but those ears are becoming slightly shorter, okay? We see average number of kernels per ear row going down, but in some cases they're becoming slightly fatter too. We tend to see a higher number of kernel rows. So we've got all these dynamics at play in terms of as we're adjusting seeding rates, and that plant has a different amount of resources available to it, how it's responding. And same way, kernel weight tends to go down a little bit as yield per plant goes up. We've got more kernels, so they tend to be a little bit lighter weight kernels. They don't fill as completely. Okay, so back to this chart we showed earlier. Here's these two hybrids, 5,000 seed difference to get that 150 bushel yield. What's really driving that? Well, so basically it's back to this idea of yield per plant is declining faster in this hybrid with than it is this one. So that really shifts what that optimal seeding rate should look like. How can we tease some of this out from an on-farm approach? I really think one of the biggest indicators to think about is how does this corn respond at the far extremes of seeding rate? Very often when we're looking at doing on-farm trials, we don't set our rates wide enough. A 2,000 seed per acre difference isn't likely to show a response, especially if we're trying to measure that with a combine yield monitor. We really need treatment strips that are at least 300 feet long, multiple locations in the field. And one thing I'll point out, this is some work we did down in Stanton County a number of years ago. If you've got some highly variable ground, we can use that to our advantage to get a better feeling for this. So here's a field, that had been leveled at one point for flood irrigation. So we see a really strong difference in soil texture gradient across that field. We can use that to our advantage by laying in the seeding rate blocks on those different soil types. And so within this one field can really get a look at all the different soil types that the grower might have across his entire operation. So if we've got that information, we can use that variability to set up these treatment strips. And part of this is coming back to how do we put this in a variable rate seeding script. One way of thinking about that is, thinking about a normalized yield goal. So you've got a map of yield potential or yield goal for your field. That's what I would use to drive my variable rate seeding script. And so I might say, okay, on average, and here I've got two different, this is an irrigated example. Let's fast forward to a dryland example. Here I've got two different hybrids, more of a flex steer or more of a fixed steer hybrid, okay, where we know it's going to take a little higher seeding rate to get there. I might say that, hey, my field average is 100 bushel, and with this hybrid, I'd need 16,000 seeds to hit that. As opposed to this more fixed-eared hybrid, for that 100 bushel, I'd need more like 19,000 seeds. And then you set a range. You say, okay, maybe I've got some sand pockets in this field. I've got some areas that maybe only have a 50 bushel yield potential. And so I would plant those at about 12,000. Maybe the best ground, I've got some really good deep silt loams in one end of the field, and I'm going to push that ground. It always produces well, and I need 20,000 seeds to hit that. And so it's really just a matter of saying, okay, what are my endpoints here for this particular hybrid versus my range of yield expectations in the field? And then it's just really a matter of fitting we can do this in Excel, just fit a regression to it. And now you've got an equation you can plug into, if you're using SMS or Ag Studio or whatever software you're using, can then stick that equation in there using your yield goal map and to generate that variable rate seeding script. But part of what helps us determine these endpoints is looking at these hybrids in the field at an 8,100 seeding rate, at a 27,000 seeding rate, and seeing how do they respond across that range. And that's what helps us dial in these endpoints to build this relationship. So my recommendations for doing this on farm, I'd really encourage you, even if you don't plan on making it big enough to harvest with a combine for yield monitor, still just the observational value, just do your planter width by even 150 feet. And maybe you go from, put some little blocks out that are 8,100, that are 27,000. On irrigated, I like to go from 12,000 to 50,000. And even just to have these from an observational standpoint, if your seedsman says, hey, I've got this new hybrid that we're going to have more of next year, I can get you a plot bag of it. This would be a good exercise to do with some of those things that you might be planting next year. Do that next against your most popular hybrid on the farm and get a feel for how they respond differently across seeding rates. Here's the thing to really keep in mind, and this is what we see at that 8,100 rate. What we learn there is, when you have a non-prolific hybrid, if it's only going to set 1 ear per plant, you're going to leave yield on the table if your seeding rate is too low. Because if it's not prolific, it doesn't have that ability to flex up to meet the environment in a good year. Because yield per plant is maxed out. We've got the biggest, fattest, heaviest ear we're going to raise, and we're only going to do 1 per plant. And so we've got to make sure we match, make the number of plants match our environment. Here's a good thing to look at is if yield per plant is the same as you go from 8,000 to 14,000, or say if you go from 8,000 to 16,000 and your yield exactly doubles, that's a pretty good sign we're still maxed out in terms of yield per plant. And so we want to make sure if we're using those hybrids that are non-prolific, we want to make sure we've got a high enough seeding rate that we're not capping ourselves and leaving yield on the table. Okay, so we talked about prolificity, all the yield components here, but what about tillers? So we'll take a bit of a turn here. So we got a poll question for you. Tillers and dryland corn, what's your gut reaction? If I ask you what your thoughts about tillers are, well, okay, option A, heck yes, the more the merrier. I like tillers. B, I'd rather not have them, but okay, shoulder shrug. C, I don't care at all. Or D, I will not plant a hybrid if I see that it tillers. It's kind of an interesting question because people tend to have very strong opinions on this. I tend to have a strong opinion on it, but actually in the research literature, we don't have a lot of data that really points us towards what the right answer is. And so that's what I'm going to talk a little bit next about some work we've got looking at that. So a little bit of background, and here's some of the earlier work we have. This would have been done at Tribune back in the mid-2000s, where there was 18 different hybrids in a study, and was basically looking at what are common characteristics for corn hybrids that do well in a dryland environment, okay? And a lot of different things were measured in that study, but just focusing on the tiller piece of this, and this is looking at ears with grain. And I apologize, this is in metric, but I've got the standard units here. So 50 1,000 ears per hectare would be equivalent to roughly 20,000 per acre. So the 30 comes out to roughly 12,000 per acre. But in general, the take-home message here is, and this is in 2005, 6, and 7, the reoccurring trend is that as tiller population goes up, number of tillers per acre goes up, the number of ears with harvestable grain tends to decline. And so on average, what this worked out is basically about 1/3 of a bushel per acre for every 1,000 tillers per acre. Okay, so say, for example, if you were planted at 17,000, that's basically saying 1 tiller per plant would be reducing, if every plant had a tiller on it, you'd be reducing yield by about 5 bushel an acre. Okay. Now, one of the limitations here is they just looked at tillers. We didn't look at whether those tillers were actually contributing any yield or not. So this is one of the few data points that we have, but really it's pretty empty out there. So next I'll be showing some slides from Rachel Veenstra. She's a graduate student working with Ignacio Ciampetti in the agronomy department at K-State. And so they have this project in conjunction with Corteva, and then I'm hosting one of the locations for it here at Colby. And so and Rachel's got some real nice pictures here, but if we think about tillers, we've got, really 3 potential development outcomes. So we've got, vegetative tillers, which I think those are the ones we most often have a negative connotation with in our mind, because we know we're burning water to grow this biomass that's, may or may not be contributing to our productivity. One of the things I guess one of the things I hear out of the pro-tiller crowd, so to speak, is, well, we've got the ability to relocate, in the grain fill process, we can relocate resources out of these vegetative tillers and help with grain fill. And so, and there is some of that translocation that happens. However, that's an active process. It requires energy to do that. So we're back to, what is that trade-off? What's it cost us to remobilize assimilate that carbohydrate from the tillers into the grain? So vegetative, and then of course tassel ear, and the challenge there is, how much harvestable grain do we really get out of those? We probably recover some of it, but not likely, not a very large percentage in it, and it tends to be pretty low quality grain, right? If we get it harvested. But what we do see, though, sometimes are these lateral ears, where actually we do set some productive ears on tillers. And I think this is where the hybrid interaction really comes into this. Is it a hybrid that's more prone to setting, if it does tiller, is it going to set these lateral ears, or are they going to be vegetative or tassel? And so there's a huge hybrid interaction in here, but then also an environmental interaction too. Tillering is a plant response to saying, hey, life's good. The environment looks great. I've got plenty of water. I've got plenty of nutrients. I've got plenty of sunlight. I should do something with it. And so we've got this interaction of environment in terms of, what's the environmental conditions like when we've got these opportunities to tiller? What's the hybrid piece to that? And then what happens to the environment after the fact? Do we start setting all of these tillers and then things turn off tough? What happens then? Okay, so here's the plots that we've got with Rachel. So we've got 3 densities out there, 10, 17, and 24,000. This is all dry land. Okay, so we've got those. We got looking at 2 different hybrids, so 0657 and 0805 from Pioneer. And then we've got a couple different tiller treatments, and Rachel's really focused on either leaving them intact or removing them at V10. We've got another treatment at Colby where we're removing them at V5, because I think it's important if we're looking at that difference between tillering and not tillering, I wanted one earlier step of removal in there to look at. And so we're basically going through on hands and knees, literally pulling the tillers off the plants out of the treatments that we're removing them from. And just leaving them in the row. And so you can see here, this is a pretty stark visual of, this hybrid. I don't know exactly which hybrid this is, but there's a lot of tillers in there, and you don't really notice how much leaf area, how much biomass the tillers are adding to the whole picture until you go through and yank them all off and leave them laying in the row. And so it kind of real interesting, just visually, it really drives home how much biomass there can be tied up in these tillers. Okay, what about yields? So here's the average across multiple locations. These are across the dryland locations. So here's at 10,000, 17,000, 24,000 plants per acre. The green bars represent leaving the tillers intact, and the yellow bars represent where we went in and removed the tillers. And so at these two higher seeding rates, no significant impact on yield, whether the tillers were left in place or removed. And at this lowest seeding rate, at the 10,000 plants per acre, we actually see higher yields with leaving the tillers in place. And so then again, this is a hybrid that's got that ability to actually set some productive ears, some lateral ears. And so we do have the ability, obviously look at our yield levels in here, we're talking 120 to 170 bushel dryland corn. Obviously 10,000 plants per acre is probably too low, right? We're not capturing our yield potential out there. And so, but with the tillers, we are able to make up for some of that. So they positively changed yields at the low seeding rate or had no effect at the two higher seeding rates. But there's a limit to how far tillers can compensate. Notice that in these, even with the tillers, we're still at 144 bushels, statistically not different, but numerically we're still 10 bushel off, 12 bushel off from what if we would have planted it at 17,000 to begin with, or for this particular year, what if we would have planted it at 24,000? So there is a limit to that compensation ability that we can get out of these tillers. And I would argue this is fairly hybrid specific too. I think a different hybrid could give us a quite different answer on this. Okay, so 2020, this is a limited irrigation site over at Goodland, so much higher yield potentials with some timely rains involved. Here we are, 24,000, we're up 220 bushel corn, 17,000, we're raising 200 bushel corn. But again, seeing a pretty good contribution to final yield from tillers at this lowest seeding rate. Again, we're, basically tillers are bringing, basically 70 bushel to the table. So moving on. Okay, so Colby low yield environment, and this would be actually in a continuous corn situation, dryland corn on corn. And so in this situation, no difference from tillers either left or removed on any of these. And so, and I guess in my mind, this is the environment, when we're talking at 100 bushel and 100 bushel less, that's the environment where I guess if tillers are causing us a negative effect, I would expect to see that to start showing up. But in 2020, we did not see that here at Colby. Okay, so looking at percent of our harvested ears, where did they come from? And so this is the various seeding rates across the top, so 10, 17, 24,000. And not surprisingly, as we go to higher and higher seeding rates, a larger percentage of the ears are coming off the main plant. Not surprising there. And it's really only at the 10,000 rate where the tiller lateral ears are having a significant contribution. The exception to that's Goodland at the 17,000. And keep in mind, this is limited irrigation. We're still, even at 17,000, about 20% of the harvested ears are coming from those lateral tillers. Only at one site, and this is in far eastern Kansas, so near Manhattan, so not really dry land per se, but they're, for whatever reason in that environment, seen a much higher percentage of tassel ears come into the mix as well. Okay, so the main takeaways so far, at least in Rachel's study here, tillers have never reduced yields regardless of the yield environment. I would couch that though with the fact that these have been fairly high yield environments. Almost all of them have really basically been above 100 bushel, and quite a few of those are significantly above 100 bushel. And so hopefully, I say that tongue in cheek when I say hopefully, but a mix of some tougher dryland environments in there would sure be nice to kind of round out our view of this. Environment and resources available to the plant are important for both tiller appearance and then whether that tiller actually develops an ear. Obviously, lateral ears are preferred for tiller development. They're the most likely to contribute grain. While tillers do have the potential to boost yields of low populations to match higher densities, mainly observed in these higher yielding environments, and there's a limit to that. As we saw in several of those examples, planting at 10,000 and relying on tillers is not necessarily going to get you to the same place as if you would have planted 17,000 to begin with. So anyways, and Rachel likes to say, maybe corn tillers aren't suckers after all. So something to think about, and hopefully we'll continue to get more data on that topic. So I'm going to round this out with just a little bit of discussion on some hybrid maturity and seeding date, planting date work that we've been doing. So this has primarily been at Colby and Tribune. We also was able to capture 1 year of data up near Smith Center and 1 year of data near Olmutz. We're hoping to get back in the rotation and do some of those on-farm trials again. It just kind of depends on funding availability and our ability to put some fuel in the truck. So we're going to start with this question. If you could plant all of your dryland corn on one day, what would it be? So you could enter like 5-31 or 5/31 if May 31st would be your magic date. But if you could plant it all in one day, what would be that magic day that you would choose? I had an ag engineer, teacher that always talked about this when he was talking about sizing machinery. It was the golden moment. If you could plant it all or harvest it all at that golden moment, what would it be? And the problem with asking this question is I'm guessing we have a wide range of geographies on the call today as well. And so that is probably driving this in part also. Okay, so oops, what would I do? Okay, so there we go. So yeah, pretty nice wide range of responses. And so that kind of mimics the range of planting dates that we've been looking at in this trial. Okay, now the second part of this question. Now, on that magic day of planting, what length of hybrid would you be dumping in the planter in terms of relative maturity, in terms of days? On that magic day of planting, what length of hybrid would you be dumping in the boxes? Okay, so not surprisingly, along with our range in planting dates, we've got quite a range in hybrid maturities that folks would be using. Okay, so the background to this, really our only dryland corn planting date research was done in Western Kansas, was done in the early to mid 90s at Garden City. We hear a lot from producers, and I've experienced this myself, specifically out here in Northwest Kansas, seeing improved yields from later planting. And we've got a bit of a conflict there in terms of what our RMA final plant date is. And so we really wanted to ask the question, is this real? Is it just a function of our recent years? And how does hybrid maturity play a role into this decision? Because it's really not just planting date. We've got this whole planting date hybrid maturity interaction that plays a role. So there's a couple different planting date philosophies. And so we've got some they're maybe more defensive. And so we think about early corn early. And in the early days of dryland corn in Western Kansas, that was talked about a lot, was early corn early. And obviously, I would argue still is the predominant strategy, especially in South Central Kansas, where their soils warm up a little faster. They can get an earlier planting date. And they're trying to beat the heat, really, is what the strategy there is. We've talked about, and we've heard, shorter season hybrids to reduce water use, and that certainly is true. I think I took those slides out. We've been measuring water use in some of these studies, and it is true that shorter season hybrids do reduce water use. But there's trade-off there. Typically, if you're using less water, you're also raising less yield. And so then it comes into there's a timing game part of that as well. I think the strategy that I see taking a little more acres out west here, at least what guys have in mind as we're moving this planting date later, is maybe we're planting medium or even in some cases medium full season hybrids later with the idea of getting grain fill on the other side of the heat, especially at our higher elevations. We really start to cool off in the evenings. So can we get our grain fill on the other side of the heat? And then there's always the offensive approach, and that is I'm going to plant the longest season hybrid that the environment can support. I'm shooting for max yields. I'm not worrying about water availability. I want to maximize my light interception and my ability to convert that into grain. So there's some different philosophies, some different strategies involved. What's changed since we've started growing dryland corn? I think about, we've got a lot of guys in Northwest Kansas been growing dryland corn for, 20, 30 years now. Certainly the companies have made huge progress and improved cold vigor and emergence. Cold emergence scores are often part of the company literature now. You can often get the actual cold germs from your seedsman. And that's especially important for our no-till systems, going back into heavy residue, stripper head wheat stubble, cover crops, whatever. The yield competitiveness of mid and short season hybrids has improved. It's a little bit of a chicken and the egg, again, as companies have tried to move the corn growing area further up in the Dakotas and even into the prairie provinces. Been a lot of focus on the performance of those mid and short season hybrids. We've seen some reduction in ear flex and full season hybrids. And that concerns me because I think ear flex is a key attribute we need for performance in our highly variable environments. And so there's been a bit of a move away from that and more towards the development and release of more deterministic hybrids, fixed eared hybrids. Climate variability, yeah, our climate's variable, has been for a long time. And then machine capacity's changed a lot. How many acres are we trying to cover per row? How many acres per day? How am I trying to spread that machinery investment? How many day planning window am I typically running over? Okay, so a little bit walk through history here. Here's 2019, our Rma Plant Dates. This is what's really driven us to start looking at some of this. We were at a May 31 cutoff for the vast majority of the state. 2010, they moved that back to May 25th, and that's really when a lot of our producers were put in a bind because we got a lot of acres of corn dryland still going in after the 25th, and people actually wanting to move more that direction. 2017, still on 25th. We did some heat unit modeling work and submitted that to RMA, and I think, at least I've been told, that at least played some role in getting them to move that planting date for far western Kansas back to May 31st, starting with the 2018 year. And that's basically where we're still at today. It's for basically these western 4 or 5 tiers of counties being on May 31st, the bulk of the rest of the state on the 25th, and then we're still May 15th down here. But again, this is the area where we're talking about early corn early really being that optimal strategy. Okay, so one thing we've talked about this a lot over the years, but predicting probabilities of success. This is where we've used some historical weather data to look at cumulative heat units from planting to a killing freeze for various planting dates and hybrid maturities. We're using book value GDUs to black layer, and we're assuming those are correct and stable. And there's obviously a lot of fuzz around that, but this is our best shot at it. So here's an example of one of these tables. These are available on my website. I've got these for 50, 60 locations in north central Kansas. We also pull in some border locations from Colorado and Nebraska. But you can hear, and basically you look across the top by planting date versus the relative maturity or whatever, or if you got the GDUs on the hybrid, you can pick your closest GDU. Here's the probability of getting this number of heat units in between from the planting date until first freeze. Okay, so you can kind of see, for a given planting date and a given hybrid maturity, what's my probability of getting enough heat units. When you open this file, there's some narrative in there. Make sure you read that. There's some disclaimers. I'll tell you, just in general, I think these are very conservative estimates. So it's, you can kind of take several locations, blend them together, adjust them a bit, but it's at least a starting point. So feel free to look that up on the web. When you get on the fringe, things change pretty fast. And so here's a June 12th planting date. Let's just look at the 30 miles from Colby to Hoxie. 108-day corn planted June 12th. We're saying it's got a 60% chance of finishing at Hoxie and a 21% chance of finishing at Colby. But there's just that much difference in those 30 miles due to elevation, due to temperature, that when you're starting to ride the edge, It can really shift things pretty fast. And again, those seem kind of low, but you can read the details. These are conservative estimates. Okay. But, so we did all that, but ultimately we still short of field data. And this is one of my favorite quotes: without data, you're just another person with an opinion. And we try not to do that. So our goal is to evaluate a combination of maturities and planting dates and ask the questions: is there an advantage to planting later? Do hybrids adjust when planted later? And ultimately the goal is to create a solid data set that we can use for some crop modeling. Everything was done no-till into wheat stubble, except for 1 year at Barton County that went into bean stubble. We're dropping 17,000 seed at Tribune and Colby and 19,500 at Olmutz and Smith Center. Here's the hybrids we used in 2020. We've had a few change-ups in here, but by and large, this is the package of hybrids we're using. We went to 3 different companies that we knew had completely separate genetic pools so that we weren't getting anything relabeled or related to each other. So we went to Pioneer, AgriLiant, LG, and then Monsanto DeKalb, or now Bayer, I guess, but the DeKalb and Channel lines. So we knew these were 3 distinct genetic pools. We said, hey, we need a short, a medium, and a full season hybrid. And so, and really all the results that I'll present, we're averaging these together. Okay, so we average these 3 hybrids together to give us our short season yield. These 3 hybrids get averaged together for our medium season yield, and these 3 get averaged for our full season yield. And that way, the danger of doing this, we could have went and just done this with 3 hybrids, 1 short, 1 medium, 1 long. But if there's, for some reason, a hybrid doesn't do well that year, or I did a poor job of picking a hybrid, well, now all of a sudden you've really unfairly biased all short season hybrids just because you did a bad job of picking a hybrid that year. And so I think this is a much more fair approach, is to get this subset across the industry and then take the average of it. Okay, here's one of the things that's probably been interesting from a phenology standpoint. Most book guides will tell you it takes 900 to 120 or 100 to 120 GDUs to get to emergence. Our high residue, cooler soils, especially early on in the season, this is at Tribune, it's taking us quite a few more heat units sometimes to get that corn up and out of the ground. Now, I will say I like to plant corn deep, okay? These book values came out of the Corn Belt. I assume they probably came out of tilled soils, and I'm going to bet they're planting their corn a lot shallower than I am. And so, again, just a reminder that we got to keep all these things in mind. Okay, so we'll look at some of the individual years here. Smith Center 2018, really nice corn yields that year. All these are laid out the same as you move from left to right. Blue's the short season hybrids, orange is the mid-season, gray is the full season, and then the yellow is the average across all 9 hybrids in the study. So that gives you an overall view of the yield environment for that planting date. Interestingly, so if you look at from the early May on out through the early June planting, basically flat when you average all the hybrids together. We see the performance of the full season hybrids start to drop off a little bit. The mid-season basically flat. The short season we pick up a little bit. Now, by the time we're out here to mid-June, still pretty respectable yields, and these all did black layer that year. But and really not much of a difference between maturities when we get out to that latest planting date. But certainly early May at Smith Center that year, there was a huge advantage to planting those full season hybrids, and that really persisted. And even on June 1, there was no advantage. And I guess this is going to be a reoccurring theme. Oftentimes we get in a late plant situation. There's, sometimes people get really concerned about, I need to roll to a shorter season hybrid. And I think what you'll consistently see, this shorter season hybrid group, there's no real clear advantage to rolling a lot of acres to it, even once we get out into a June planting date. And so I think that's kind of one of the key take homes out of this. Barton County. So again, I think this kind of reinforces what we've seen there was, early corn early. But, even then, we're still getting some nice yield responses out of the full season hybrids. It really isn't until, the June 1 planting date that stuff really starts to flatten out a bit. And then certainly by the mid-June planting date, then we are giving up some yield out of that full season hybrid. But even early on in mid-May, we're not getting a huge response to that short season hybrid. In fact, it's back quite a few bushel. So, the early planting seems to be panning out at this one site year data, but we didn't see that benefit to using an early maturing or short season hybrid. Okay, Colby 2018, we did have moderate hail on June 30th. We do see slightly, our highest average yields were at this mid-May plant date, but really not much different on June 3rd. Really, statistically, really no different when we look across the hybrids here. Still a nice response, even on June 1. Our mid or our full season hybrids beating our short season ones by 20 bushel or better. And so we're still not seeing that. Now, obviously, we get out to mid-June, these full season ones, we dropped off quite a bit of yield, and these are pretty low test weight too. We had a lot of these that didn't meet black layer. Here's this last year at Colby. 2019 we lost due to wind damage. 2020 at Colby, really fairly flat, but even here on June 3rd, interestingly, no difference between our short season and our full season hybrids. And that's really when our shortest season ones did the best. If we're mid-May, we're sitting back quite a bit on these short season ones. Okay, now here's our most complete data sets down at Tribune. Alan Schlegel and his guys there have been terrific and working with me on this project. So here's 2018, and here's kind of, a real classic response. They also get an earlier date down there. And so here we are mid-April. That's planting early at Tribune in 18 was not the answer. Here's mid-May. Really mid-June where we're maximizing our yields, getting a nice response to hybrid maturity there as we go from the short to the full season hybrids. Pretty flat, but very respectable yields on this, end of May, 1st of June date. And then here, we just know we're getting pretty short in our environment. 19, much flatter across the board. In general, a slight decline in yields with later planting. Did not see very big differences amongst hybrid maturity. Pretty flat, really, not particularly exciting. Although, really never does the short season hybrid really knock our socks off on anything. Okay, here's this last year at Tribune. Kind of this flat line response out to mid-May, and then we did give up some yield going to the 1st of June and then mid-June. So this is kind of the most dramatic response we'd seen, negative response to the late planting. Here's averaged across years. And if we average across hybrids, our optimum's showing up in about this mid-May, but still not bad early June. Early June's no worse than early May. And I guess that's maybe one of the other take home here is this is a fairly wide window. And so hopefully we can continue to work with RMA to say, hey, there's really no more risk on June 1 than there is May 15th. And so can we widen this window out a little bit? So take home message, in general, our planting gate response is generally flatter, I think, than a lot believe in a number of our locations. I don't think that's true everywhere, but a fairly wide window. Planting in early June, seldom worse than early May and sometimes better. Barton County, and as we move further south and east, likely to be exceptions. Here's the thing I think really is worth thinking about. And I think we've seen more acres moving towards shorter season hybrids. Certainly there's some very popular products in that maturity group, but at least in our data, the short season hybrid group did not have a yield advantage in any environment and often left yield on the table, even at a June 1 planting date. And so, if we get into a late plant situation, I really think we need to hold the reins back on rolling to shorter hybrids. And I think, and just in general, maybe look at the portfolio of products we're using on our farms, and are we getting a little heavy on the short season side? A given combination isn't always going to be the right answer. The real question is what hybrid by maturity minimizes risk and maximize profits over the long term. Max yield in any individual year doesn't really tell us that. And so that's why our future steps with this is to hopefully do some crop modeling where we can plug in 100 years of weather data and say, okay, based on what we observed in the field in these years, 100 years of weather data, what's the best right answer over time? That's where we want to go eventually. Thank you for your support. If you've been an attendee for Cover Your Acres, you've helped fund this work. We've been unable to get funding from the the Corn Commission or other venues. And so we try and rob some dollars out of Cover Your Acres to do this work, and really thank our partners at Pioneer, LG, and DeKalb Channel. They've been very generous in providing seed and their expertise, and really appreciate their partnership on this and many others. All right, Sandra, I'm over time. You're rolling out the gong to usher me off the stage. So.
Okay. All righty. Well, thanks again, Lucas. I know I always have lots of questions on planting dates, rates, especially out here, not only out there in Northwest Kansas, but out here in North Central Kansas too. So it looks like we had some questions coming in on the Zoom. So Craig's been monitoring that. So Craig, you want to begin on those questions?
Yeah. Start off with on the planting date and probability charts, how low a percentage would you go? He thinks it's kind of a personal choice, but is 60 to 70% probability still reasonable plan, or should he go higher?
Yes, that's a good question, Josh. And I'd say, just in general, those those charts I present are on the conservative side. And so in that narrative, if you go to the website and open up there's that PDF there, I kind of walk through a little bit of that thought process and how what I would do is for a given planting date hybrid combination, I would kind of look around that and see how sensitive of an area in the chart you are, and say, okay, well, what if I actually, planted something a little shorter, a little earlier? Does it change that probability much? And kind of just take a blended feel, not only on that intersection of the chart that you're on, but kind of look around that and see, okay, how steep am I here? Now, if you're in a fairly stable area of the chart, I'm going to feel a lot more comfortable with that than, hey, if I'm right on the edge of where this thing's really dropping off steeply, then to me, that's an indication there's a little more risk involved. And it doesn't hurt to look at multiple locations either. If you're in between 2 or 3 locations that we have on that chart, I'd kind of take a blended average of them, because there can be some pretty stark, as I showed just between Hoxie and Colby, there's a huge difference there. So I would blend, some of the locations that are closest to you.
All right. Do you have individual results for each of the hybrids?
Yeah, we do. I'm kind of thinking through how we're gonna do that. It really wasn't set up to be a hybrid trial. We were just trying to have representative things, and so that's why we've really been focused on presenting these maturity groups. I think that's something moving forward. I think we may look at maybe we need to visit with our industry partners and see how much appetite there would be. We've traditionally done these hybrid performance trials, and I think they've kind of limited utility, but maybe we need to change shift and actually do some management trials, and then we could offer some of this management by hybrid data actually in a hybrid performance test type scenario. So.
All right, got one more here. On the GDU to germination, you said you like to plant deep. How many inches?
Yes, I will not plant corn shallower than 2.5. And actually my most, when we're doing, emergence scorings every 12 hours, my most consistent stands have come from a depth of 3 inches. They're not fast emerging, but they're uniform. And I would rather have uniform over fast almost any day. In terms of getting all those plants up, that's something. There's a lot of talk about plant spacing, and yeah, that's important. But I think it gets a lot of attention because there's a lot of dollars of stuff that can be sold on plant spacing. If you look at the agronomic literature, what's by far more important than plant spacing is uniformity of emergence. And by planting deeper, if you think about the variability in a field, think about variability in soil moisture, soil temperature. As you go deeper in the soil, just think if you could have a map of soil moisture or soil temperature for a field. And think about what that map would look like at 1 inch depth, 2 inch depth, and 3 inch depth. That map's going to look more uniform the deeper you go, right? And so by planting deeper, one of the things we're doing is we're putting those seed into a much more uniform environment. And so I think that's one of the reasons we see more uniform emergence. It might be slower emergence, but it's going to be more uniform. And so, but I have no heartburn planting to 3 inches, especially with the quality. I mean, seed quality's come so far in the last 10, 15 years in terms of vigor and emergence out of cold soils. Yeah, Jay, that's a great comment as well, and that's part of why we wanted to use multiple hybrids in this, because we know, that's one of the things that gives me a lot of heartburn. I think back to some of the research I've done over the years. I think back to all of the clump and skip row corn work that we did at Tribune for a lot of years. By and large, it was all done with one hybrid, 33B54, because it was a really popular dryland corn. But it does make you wonder on some of these studies, if we would have done it with a different hybrid, how different would have our results been? Because we know all these hybrids respond differently to environment and management.
Okay. All righty. Well, thanks again. It doesn't look like there's any more questions coming in. So if you do have a question or you think of one after we get off here, just go in and email your extension agent and we can get those to Lucas, or you can email those directly to Lucas. Whichever one is just fine with us. So it doesn't look like there's any more questions. I will turn it on back to Chris.
All right. I think we already had the question pop up into the Q&A box, but for those that are needing the CCA credits, here is the QR code for today's session. Again, if you did it by email, you would should have emailed Jeannie to start the session, and then you can go ahead and email her now if you're doing by email. If not, if you want to do the QR code, here is that for today's session. So leave that up there for just a couple more seconds. I'll let you folks go ahead and get that in. All right. Now I believe it looks like Craig has already posted the link for the Qualtrics survey. We do appreciate you going ahead and completing that questionnaire and survey. It gives us some information to help guide us for future programming and some other information, some of our reporting responsibilities with this as well. So if you can, please log into that link that is there in the chat box and complete that short survey. It's not going to take you very long. It's going to have a bit of an evaluation to help us out. It is also in the YouTube chat box as well if you're joining us on YouTube. So again, please fill out that information. Shouldn't take but a couple of minutes, and it's very valuable information to help us with all of our future endeavors. So do want to thank you for participating in all of our sessions. Whether you joined today, whether you had us, on for a couple sessions, whatever it is, we thank you for participating in all these sessions over the last month and a half or so that we've been doing this. Again, thanks to all of the agents to help make this possible. If you have any questions, again, don't hesitate to contact your local extension office or any of the agents that are involved with the sessions here in the last 6 weeks. If you have any questions for a particular presenter, we can contact them as well. If you didn't get their information at the end of their sessions, whether it was Lucas or any of the others, we'd be glad to help answer whatever questions there may be. So again, thanks for all participating. Sandra, did you have anything else?
One other thing, if they miss some of the sessions, those recordings are posted along with the handouts at several different locations.
Yes, should be able to find those. I know here in the Walnut Creek District, those usually get posted up on our Facebook page by the end of the week. Some of the other local units are doing similar items, might even find them on their local unit website. So again, if you missed any sessions, you want to go back and find them, contact your local extension office. They'll be able to help you out with where those might be located if you are not already following them on social media or accessing their website regularly. So, yep, join us for any of those. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to contact us. With that, that is going to be it for today. Again, thanks everybody, and thanks to the agents for doing this. And Stacy has even thrown on there the Northwest area or regional office for these sessions as well. The recordings are there, handouts are there. Go back, find whatever you need, and we'll go from there. So appreciate it, and we will catch you guys later. Thanks.